So again, welcome everyone. Today we will be covering a kind of a beginner look at statistics in ARM, dealing with the AOV analysis and frequently asked questions, things that come up when working with the analysis in ARM. Going to try to cover quite a few topics, so we'll go somewhat quickly. I've got a lot of the interface condensed down into screenshots for us in this presentation. Trying to, like I said, get through a lot of the topics in this 1 hour time frame. But for kind of a deeper look into these functions, we are putting the finishing touches on our ARM beginner statistics certification. So much like we have just the beginner certification where there's a few courses you can learn how to use ARM for the first time or brush up on its use, we're going to have a series of videos that basically follow this same structure, but of course, looking specifically into ARM and going through some examples. So that look for that probably within the month is what we're hoping for. So we're real close to that, and that'll hopefully just be a nice, I guess we'll call it a side-by-side to this presentation where we'll go just a little bit quicker pace. But feel free to slow us down at any point if you do have questions. That's obviously our biggest advantage here, being live together if you do have questions. All right, we'll just start at the very basics here. Of course, your goal of your research is simply to determine whether your treatments of interest perform differently. And so the choice of treatments, of course, depends on your experiment. They could be different products, different formulations, different rates of application. At any rate, we want to know if those treatments can be distinguished from one another, whether it's in their effectiveness, the safety to the crop, the cost, anything like that. So then we perform research trials, so that way we can obtain observations of the treatment performance. In ARM, we will call those assessments or ratings. But the question is, are the observed differences that we see in those observations due to the treatments or just due to random chance? So that's really where statistics come in, namely the analysis of variance will be our focus. Of course, we should not immediately jump to the analysis right after you record data. The data confirmation is an important step to catch outliers, any issues with the assessment as it's been recorded, to ensure accuracy before the analysis begins. So the best way to ensure accuracy is by reviewing the assessment immediately afterwards while you're still at the trial site. That way, if you have any irregular values, those can be investigated and resolved. If you're waiting to input and review the data back in the office, any of those irregularities can only be ignored in the analysis, which results in a loss of statistical power. So we'll kind of take a look at the tools for that step real briefly here today in the next slide. But the issues that we're looking for sometimes are simply just a typo from data entry. Or it could be an outlier, which would be an observation that is outside the normal or expected distribution. Another trick for data accuracy, you could identify an acceptable range of values before the assessment is even taken. And that way the extreme values kind of stand out when you're doing the note taking, which can cut down on the surprises at the end review. So looking at the functions in ARM for this step. The primary one is the assessment map, which you can open up from the properties panel at the right-hand side of the assessment editor. So there it's highlighted there. Just when you're looking at the data itself, whichever column of data that you're clicked into at the moment, go over to the properties panel and press that button, and then we will have a assessment map appears. And so this is really a heat map that visualizes your selected assessment. So the colors are based on the smallest and largest recorded values in that column. That makes it easy to spot those extreme values. In this case, it's pretty clear that plot 904 really stands out. It is much larger than all of the other recorded values. So if we were to investigate the actual values in that column, in this case we have 120. And our make-believe assessment here is percent area of leaves that are diseased. So it's not even possible to have 120 at any rate. So clearly it's a typo, but what can we do? It could be a 20, this could be a 10, it could even be a 12 maybe. That's kind of the reason to be doing this review while you're still in the field. We could simply go back over to plot 904 and confirm what the correct value should be. Otherwise, if we're just putting this into the software, the next rainy day that we get a chance to, there's really nothing we can do sitting here in the office looking at this value outside of just throwing it away. So it's a missed opportunity of having a real value, and it is going to impact negatively our statistical power that we'll be able to have when we're trying to draw conclusions. A question on changing the range of differing colors. Right now, ARM does just calculate this automatically. So there really isn't an option to control the scale or the coloring. I do think, as you can tell, if you're familiar with our trial map, this assessment map is really just an overlay on the regular trial map tool that we have. And we are kind of overhauling the trial map. And so I think in the future, you'll probably have some, a little more control over the coloring options, as it were. But as of right now in ARM, we're kind of locked into this. It'll calculate the lowest and the highest value, and I think chop it up into up to 10 ranges. But yeah, there's not a lot of control for changing that range. Good question. And yeah, to bring up the assessment map, it's a pretty well hidden secret, I would say. Let me toggle to ARM real quick here because I do have it open. When you're on the assessment section, just go ahead and click anywhere in the assessment you want to take a look at. And over on the right, on the properties panel, there's a section called Tools, and there's a button here to open the assessment map. So that's how we get to this assessment map. And if your properties panel is not visible, then you might have to go all the way to the very right, and you can make that properties panel visible by clicking on the word there. Great question. Like I said, that one's kind of it's a kind of a hidden function. A lot of people don't know about it, just because it doesn't stand out, kind of stashed away on the properties panel there. All right, so let's say with that weird 904, hey, we can confirm that it's supposed to be a 20. So we can adjust that value in ARM, and then just open up the assessment map again. And it'll kind of redraw things. And in this case, we can see we'll learn a little more because now we don't have that really extreme value that kind of muddies the water on everything else that we'd be hoping to see. So here in this screenshot, I've done one extra thing on my map. Like we said, in the trial map itself is really the tool we're using. And so we have the option to show true scale. It's in the options tab there at the bottom underneath the map. And that will draw everything according to your trial settings, your plot dimensions, your alley widths, all those settings within the trial to give us really a realistic view spatially of the assessment, not just the little squares that represent the plot, but give us that spatial element as well. So this can help understand a little better the true patterns or anything spatial that we would see. One more thing you can do here, if you click on a specific plot, then only that treatment will be colored across the whole map. And so that's a nice way to compare that treatment's consistency across the different replicates. So you can kind of click, I like to click through the first replicate, click on each treatment to just get a sense of each treatment, how consistent was it? Another tool that can be useful for data confirmation is your Box-Whisker graph. So that's found in the very same area on the properties panel as the assessment map. And so the Box-Whisker graph, quick definitions, each treatment has a box and whiskers. That box is calculated from the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of all of the treatment values in that assessment. And then the whiskers extend out to all of the other non-outlier values. So the box height gives us a sense of the variability within that treatment. So it can be handy to compare across the different treatments. The taller the box is, the more variation that you have. The box itself is centered around the median, which is your 50th percentile. And you can also draw your mean. That's your dashed line within the box. So that can give you a view, if you compare the median and the mean, give you a sense of if there's skewness in the data. So treatment 4, for example, has kind of a high median waist, if you will. The median is pretty high compared to the mean, which tells us that there's a low value that's pulling down the mean. So giving some skewness to that treatment. And it's kind of the opposite there for treatment 5, that mean is getting pulled up. And it's specifically getting pulled up by this X, which is an outlier. And any value that is, you would calculate an outlier by taking the height of the box, multiply that by 1.5. And if the value is outside of that range above or below, then it's an outlier. So this X here, you can tell, is quite a ways, very significantly larger than any of the other values. And so it is an outlier according to the Box-Whisker. And you can hover over that X to see the plot number itself to get an idea of what value that is so extreme. So digging into outliers a little more, the biggest thing to think about with the outliers is that unusual data does not mean that it's unusable. So we shouldn't just, blindly throw out any extreme value without any thought. So, really it's where you're, as a trialist, your experience gets to shine. There's kind of a variety of things to consider about whether to keep the value or not. Things like, does the data fairly represent this trial and what we're trying to understand? Is there some sort of external force that affected this plot disproportionately to the rest of the trial? Is the value within that, a reasonable range of outcomes that we would expect to occur? So kind of hammering home the point of that, confirming the data before you leave the site. If you do decide this value is not usable, it's not representative of what we're after, or something strange happened, you can exclude the value. And you can do this, once again, it'll be on that properties panel on the right. A little farther down, there's a section titled Assessment, where there's a box to exclude the plot. We also have a spot for a comment that you can put in to explain, why am I throwing this out? And so then that will, just that one particular value that you've selected, there'll be a strike through, and in the analysis, it'll be treated as if it's just a missing data point. You can still keep the value you recorded, have all that documentation, but the analysis will see this as just a period, just a missing data point. All right, so moving on to the next step, which is really reviewing the data for analysis itself. So to set the stage, let's first give kind of a quick look at what we want to do in the end, which is the analysis of variance, or AOV. So statistical variance is a measure of how spread out the data is about its mean. The goal of AOV is to dissect that variability in your recorded assessments, to understand whether the differences we have observed between the treatments is due to the treatment itself or just that random chance. So there's controlled variability that the researcher had a hand in, from the treatment structure, the blocking structure, design, all of that. Then everything that we can't control is called the experimental error. So the overall approach is that we want to consider that the observed response really has three components. There's a baseline response if nothing had occurred in the trial, the effect that the treatments and blocking specifically had, and then there's the effect of the random influences also. And so if we want to draw conclusions about the treatment effects, we're going to want to estimate what those random or uncontrolled effects are. So to do this, we're going to need to make some assumptions about their behavior. So those are kind of the infamous assumptions of AOV. The first one is homogeneity of variance, that the variances of the different treatments are approximately equal. If you have a treatment that is much more variable or much less variable than the others, the analysis won't work. So to determine if this is the case, we can look at that box-whisker graph, and compare the heights of those boxes. Or we could also run a test, a statistical test for homogeneity of variance. The Levine's test is generally chosen. We also have Bartlett's as well. The next assumption is that the distribution of errors is normal or bell-shaped. So if we have this and equal variances, then the math can do its thing, because we can calculate a reasonable guess for the amount of error based on your standard bell-shaped curve. So a few statistical tests for this, skewness, kurtosis, and Shapiro-Wilks. Another assumption is additivity of effects, specifically of treatment and block effects in the typical RCB design. An example would be the effects of treatments like an insecticide or for a fungal attack are likely to be multiplicative on the population count. So that's affecting a proportion of your insect population. So perhaps the most suitable assessment to analyze would be a percent of untreated calculation instead of the raw counts to gauge efficacy, because we're assuming that the effects are additive. And in those cases, they might not be, the treatment might not be. Finally, the last assumption is independence of errors, that one assessment does not directly impact the next or previous value. This is hard to test for, usually not a big issue. The biggest thing is just to not introduce bias in the assessment. Things like edge effects or a subjective rating being influenced, things like that. So that assessment heat map that we looked at might be useful to detect if there is something to be concerned about there. So what happens if these assumptions are not met? Well, we cannot rely on the ANOVA results unless we take an alternative action. So we have data correction transformations, which are designed to correct the underlying distribution of the data and thus the error that we're looking at without affecting the results. So there's three main ones. The logarithm transformation, that's great for counts of things that occur in clusters because that follows a log normal distribution. The square root transformation is good for counts of things that occur randomly or rarely. Lots of zeros, and then every so often you have the presence of whatever that may be. And that's kind of a Poisson distribution. And then finally, the arcsine square root percent, that is really useful for percentage data that can be kind of a binomial distribution. Another tool for us would be spatial models. Those try to recover information about hidden variables across the field. In ARM, we have 3 different trend models and 4 different nearest neighbor models that can be used. Typically, you only would do this if your blocking design fails. And finally, non-parametric statistics. We just throw out AOV and its assumptions, and instead we analyze the data by ranking the assessment values. We can still run a mean comparison test on the means of those ranks, and so we'll still have a similar structure to our end analysis, even if we go that route. Just going to run through, try to go quickly through this process here. The main tool for actually performing the data review is the Column Diagnostics panel. So that is found in the assessment editor instead of the properties panel we've looked at so far. It is a different panel called Column Diagnostics that you can turn on there at the very far right of the screen. And so a couple of different sections on this panel. The top one has just a variety of descriptive stats about the column, like number of values, how many are analyzed versus how many are missing, things like that. There are the statistical tests for the AOV assumptions in this table as well. The reported values are p-values. So if you have significance, if the value itself is significant, that would indicate that there is a problem with that assumption. There's a column in this table for every potential course of action or data correction, those options that we just looked at. The raw, that first column there, is just everything run on the regular data points. The second column, IID, that is run on the residuals. So kind of the modern approach is to test the residuals for making decisions on what actions to actually take. The next panel right underneath that displays a recommendation based on each of those 4 statistical tests. So here we've got IID is the recommended code. That particular action code doesn't actually change anything in the analysis, but it's just a way to mark the column as reviewed. I've taken a look and the results were, I don't fail any of those tests. And so I've taken a look. I know I don't need to take an action. Here's kind of a nice way to check this column off, if you will, that we don't have to do anything. If we look at another column where things aren't quite that simple, here's one where we have to take an action because the Levine's test is significant. They're in number 1. Before looking at that recommendations table, there is an option to called basis there in the middle, and that lets us tell ARM what type of assessment this is. So we can look at the rating type or rating unit, or just make a guess based on the values themselves. So here, if we select a rating type, ARM can see that it's count data. And so then it'll adjust the list of available transformations based on the type of data. So here that square root transformation ends up being the most appropriate for us. And it does result in no issues with the Levines or any of the other tests. So once you have an action that you want to quote unquote take, you can just double click on that AS action code, either in the table below or check mark up here in this table, depending on where you're looking at. And what happens is the assessment itself isn't changed at all. We just put in this AS as an action code in the header field of that column. And this will become instructions to ARM when we run the analysis. So the raw data is left alone. It's just something that the analysis will know. Oh, there's my screenshot there, where that is at kind of the bottom of the header description above the data values themselves. Just instructions, again, that go into the analysis later on. One more example here where we don't quite as lucky with something like the square root or another transformation fixing things. Here we can see, if we look at that, Shapiro-Wilks fails in everything we try. So we've got major problems with the normality assumption for this assessment. So if neither of those work, the recommendation is AR, which is the non-parametric statistics. And again, that's running, ranking the data points. And then instead of worrying about means and variances, we can just look at those ranks and do an analysis. It is a little less powerful of a test than the ANOVA is, so that's why kind of the default that everyone uses, if they can, is the ANOVA. But certainly the non-parametric, when the ANOVA isn't reliable for us, we'd much rather have slightly less power, but can rely on the results, as opposed to just running with the ANOVA anyway and not being real sure whether it's giving us the right answer or not, because we aren't meeting those assumptions that the math needs to give us that answer. Just real quick, there is a graphing function on that panel if you want to take a deep dive into these different assumptions. And so there's a variety of graphs, kind of before and after. Typically the left-hand side would be the data before you make any correction, and then on the right would be the side, the graph with whatever correction that you've selected, to kind of be able to dive deeper with the graphs. And that would just be the little show button underneath the graph heading there. Okay, so once we've taken a look at the data, now we can perform the analysis. So I've got an example here of the AOV output. Just kind of have made up data here with 5 different treatments from a 4-rep study, and it's yield data for whatever that's worth. So variety of calculations, we'll just run through each of them. They're kind of the different columns here in this output. First one, the degrees of freedom. Kind of hard to define. It's the number of values in a final calculation that are free to vary. So with variance, your degrees of freedom is n-1. So for 5 treatments, you would have 4 degrees of freedom. It's basically that one that you're missing is that the mean is calculated in order to determine the variance. It's kind of how that works. Next is the sum of squares, and that represents the amount of variation in the data, which we're splitting up into each source that's listed in the table. Then the mean square is the sum of squares divided by the degrees of freedom. So we're really taking the amount of variation and dividing it by the degree to which it can occur. Then we calculate an F ratio, which indicates the level of variation from that source compared to the random variation. So the larger that ratio is, the more likely that the variance from that source is not due just to random chance. So to try to quantify the strength of that ratio, we calculate a p-value. The probability that the observed differences in your treatment or your block means could have arisen by chance. So a low p-value, typically you set the bar at 5%, indicates that we can be confident that there are real differences among our treatments. Whereas if you have a high p-value, like we have here for the blocking, that would indicate that there's no evidence of a real difference between the blocks in this case. That could be because there's no real difference, or that the differences are just too small for us to detect. Okay, so to summarize, the AOV analysis breaks apart the variance of our observations into different sources, and then calculates a p-value as the end result. And that p-value is a probability. Specifically for ANOVA, the p-value is the probability that no differences in the treatments exist. So that p-value of 0.04 means we're 96% confident that there are significant differences between our treatments. But the problem is we're not done yet, because we want to know which differences are significant and which are not. And so ANOVA itself doesn't provide an answer about which treatments are different from another. It's just a general look at least two out of this list are different, but it doesn't tell us which ones. So we need to run a mean comparison test to find out specifics on which differ significantly. Also called a mean separation test. We are comparing all of the treatment means to determine what differences are truly significant. There's a variety of these tests to choose from, really depending on different situations and research types. The most common ones are here on the screen: the LSD, Duncan's new MRT, Student Newman-Kuhl's, and Tukey's HST. We must also choose a significance level, or alpha, to run these tests. It's kind of similar to the p-value for confidence in AOV results, but we're setting the threshold for significant differences for the test. So, an alpha of 0.05 implies that we only accept differences that have a probability of 95% or higher of being true. Of course, we want to make this selection prior to running any analysis, as the choice. Really, you don't want to bias your selection based on the desired outcome. And so the perfect question here is which one is better? Which one should we choose? There's kind of a few different things that are at play here for the selection. Probably first and foremost is you can kind of classify the test by how liberal or conservative they are. So this means that the test could be more likely to report a false positive, or a type 1 error, or a false negative, type 2 error. So the first 4 tests listed in ARM, those 4 from the last screen, we arrange those with the most liberal on top to most conservative. The first one then is LSD. That's the most liberal, and that means it's most likely to report differences, but that suffers from a higher false positive rate. Whereas you can be most confident in the differences that you see with the conservative Tukey's HSD, even though separation is less likely to be found. So you might overlook a real difference because you're so conservative. So kind of a balancing act, of course. Other things to consider on selection, following your industry or discipline standard for the research is a good place to start. If everyone always runs the Student Newman-Kuhl's in this industry, that might be a good place to start. You might also have your study sponsor. They might specifically request, hey, run this test, this significance level. You also can think about the purpose of the study. If If your trial is going to be used for registration of a product, then maybe a conservative test is appropriate. You can be very, very sure about the results reported. But a screening trial is all about potential. And so a more liberal test might be preferred because any false positives will be weeded out with future trials. And finally, you can consider the penalty of failure of the treatments. So, an example, the failure of a crop protection product will likely have a real big impact on yield. So an alpha level of 5% is common there. But if you've got a biological product for plant health, the penalty of failure is just the cost of the product. You just don't get the boost in the yield that you hoped. And so that has a much lower penalty of failure. So it's more common to see a 15, 20, 25% significance level in studies like that. So unfortunately, not a hard and fast, hey, this is the best one, use it all the time. Much murkier, but hopefully kind of help frame some of the decisions that go into both the test itself and your alpha level. All right, so let's run through an example of how a mean comparison test works. The specifics on the calculations vary for each test, of course, but the basic concept holds for all of them. So first, a test statistic is calculated that's used to perform the comparison of means. So our example, kind of the most simplest test, is the LSD. We'll do it at 5% significance level, and so we get a 5.49 for that data we've been using. Then we compare the largest treatment mean to each of the other means using that test statistic. If the difference between means is smaller than that LSD value, then they are not considered significantly different. So to visualize this, we can use a number line. Maybe try to make it a little easier to kind of follow along. The LSD value creates a range around each mean. And anything outside of that range is significantly different according to the mean comparison test. So let's start with that largest mean and extend down to the lower bound. All treatments within this range are not significantly different. So we assign the letter A to treatments 5, 1, and 4. They're all less than that LSD value of 5.49 away from the treatment 5 there. Then we repeat this process for each mean. Because there are no new means in this next range from treatment 1, we don't need a letter here. The next range does include treatment 2. So treatments 4 and 2 are assigned the letter B. Now the next range includes treatments 2 and 3, and so we assign that C. Now there are no more means without a letter, so we're finished. The letters are typically reported to the right of the means. And that tells us if you look at any two means, if they don't have a letter in common, then they are considered significantly different. So like 2 and 5 don't have any letters in common, so we know those two are significantly different. So in summary, we looked at the AOV analysis. It's all about breaking apart the variance that we have in our observations into different sources. And we get this p-value probability in the end. We then perform a mean comparison test to determine which of those treatment means are significant. But of course, you have to be cautious. You don't want to jump right into the analysis the second data is recorded. Steps like data confirmation to get the data in accurately and data review to test those assumptions of ANOVA are important before you generate that report. All right, so that's kind of our rundown here of the analysis done in ARM. Last week, we took a look at reporting in general. So I won't go into too much on how to run the reporting function, but certainly this, AOV analysis is one of the big selections here in this print reports dialog. Specifically in the summary here, we have our AOV means table report. And the report options, about half of them are related to the analysis, those different things that we talked through, what mean comparison test that we want to run. Here are those 4 that we talked about specifically. There are a couple of other ones used in other situations. There's a Waller-Duncan, a Dunnett test versus controller reference treatment, and the Scott-Knott. You can set your significance level as well. Do have a couple of frequently asked questions here. A lot of times as people are generating the analysis, the support questions we receive, there's a theme to them. A good proportion of them kind of revolve around the theme of, where are my letters? Seems to be kind of the big the big focus for people, is that the end result, the letters that tell me what is significantly different and what isn't. So I've rigged up a trial here I've got open that highlights some of these common problems. So I'm just going to use the report preview here in the middle of the screen. I think we'll be able to see enough of this report once I zoom in to demonstrate some of these questions here. So the first question, just looking at our report, even the very first column, the question is, where are my letters? I literally don't see any letters. I'm kind of confused. I've got my treatment means, but I've got, I don't have letters at all. Is the analysis even being done? What is happening? And the key is, although there's no letters, next to the mean, there is a symbol. There's a dash next to that mean. And that dash is coming from the report options. So if I go back to the main section of the AOV report options, the 5th one down here at the top in the mean comparison test section, there is an option for the symbol indicating no significant difference between treatment means. And our default here is a dash. So whatever is entered in this box is what ARM will show on the report when no differences have been calculated. So the dash can throw people off if you're not quite sure what that meant. I've seen NS for no significance, all caps or lowercase. You could also just put in an A. Then that by convention would look maybe a little more fitting in with the other columns. If I toggle back to the report preview, then you'll see that same character in every treatment there, which would give us the same outcome. Oh, they're all A's. They all are in the same group. There were no differences that were different between each other. So same conclusion, but gives you the control over how do I want to present this situation. If I wanted to stand out with a symbol or abbreviation, or I could just do A's even if I wanted. So that's frequently asked question number 1. The next question, and maybe it's not the next one from the same person, but oftentimes this very same situation that we're looking at, column 1, there's all A's. The question might be, yeah, it's telling me there's no significance, but I really think there should be. So it could be a matter of, well, I'm using my LSD value here and I can do the math in my head, or I took this data and I saw a difference. I could tell that treatment 5 was clearly different than my check. Why would the report not be showing me those differences? Couple of reasons that we can run into for that one. First one, we can detect if we look at the footnotes at the bottom of the report. So this is a handy spot for actually several of the questions that we see. The answer actually is kind of hiding in here. The first footnote is always going to be this means followed by same letter, and it'll just tell you your alpha level that you're running and the mean separation test that's being performed. So that's always handy to know, kind of no matter what. But the footnote that we care about here to explain why we're not getting differences when I really think there should be, this third one here, mean comparisons performed only when the AOV treatment P of F is significant at the mean comparison OSL. So this is what's known as a protected test. And if we go into the report options, it is toggled here with this checkbox, only when significant AOV treatment P of F. So this looks at that P value that we get at the end of the AOV analysis and says, well, if AOV didn't give us significance, if that P value is too high, we don't have a strong enough confidence that there's any differences at all. And if we don't think that there's any differences, then maybe we shouldn't run a mean comparison test. Because if AOV doesn't think there's any differences, what's the point in then trying to find differences? We've already determined that there isn't. So that's the rationale for this option. And it ties into that p-value. I would say it's most definitely important, and it was designed, that logic I think was designed most especially for the LSD. That's your most liberal test, and like we said, that means there's the greatest chance of a false positive being reported. So if you're running that test, then protecting the test with this idea of, well, let's not ask for a false positive. Let's first consult the ANOVA results, and let's not even bother with the test if that comes back without the significance. Obviously, if you're running a test that's maybe a little more conservative, a little less likely to give you a false positive, you would have a rationale at least to maybe not run with this option. Again, everything's scales of gray, nothing's black and white. It's statistics, so it's tricky. But that's the idea there. And I think originally the LSD was Fisher's protected LSD test would be kind of the nice name given to this combination here specifically. There was a question here on that abbreviation that we mentioned, the mean comparison OSL. And I believe OSL stands for observed significance level. In my brain, it's that same value as the alpha level. I'm assuming it's really, probably the difference is your alpha is planned before the fact, whereas then the observed significance level would be what we chose to run. But I'll admit I don't know that as a slam dunk. So, but yeah, that's looking at the p-value, and so our treatment probability of F there, we can see for column 1 is 0.08. So we just miss it. We're only 92% confident that there's really differences here, and so we miss that cutoff of the 5%. Certainly, we could turn that off. And see if we get letters. Obviously, we're doing that as a demonstration here. The statistician would stand up and shake their fist at me for saying that, because we're statistically designing these decisions in theory before any data is even taken, but certainly before we look at these results. Now, going back to tweak them just in hopes of seeing what we want to see isn't sound statistical practice. So I have to caveat that as we're toggling back and forth, trying to just demonstrate the various configurations. But hopefully don't take this as as statistical advice to fiddle around until you see what you want. So here now I've turned off that option. So we are in fact running a test. Now we're still stuck without significance letters, and that's because, again, I've rigged this up to be just fitting the needle here, with the very last example of why don't I get letters. Again, maybe I'm well versed enough to know what the LSD value is here for, and I can say, well, look, 11.7, 13.4, that's a bigger difference than my LSD measuring stick. So how come I don't see differences? And the final answer there, again, we can see in the footnotes because we know what comparison test we're running. And here we're running the student Newman-Kuhl's, which is not the same as running the LSD test. And in fact, it's more conservative, so less likely to give us a false positive, more likely to overlook something. So if I was using the LSD value to do a comparison and asking why does ARM not show that same difference, it might be because I'm not running that comparison test. So if I run the LSD comparison test for this column, I believe at long last, we'll finally see some differences. And of course, we can ask ourselves, well, cool, great, we've got letters. Do we really feel all that great that these really are true differences? Because we've had to game about everything that we can just to finally get to see something. Maybe tells us something about the reality of the data set. Granted, of course, it's all fake, so that way I can show all of them, but at any rate. So those are the most common questions, at least, that we get, and trying to show kind of where you can connect the dots on those. We have hit our hour here. I can stick around for a minute or two if there are any other questions. But that was a lot of statistics in a short amount of time. So I don't blame anyone for having their fill. But as I said, try to go quick. I wanted to cover everything, even if we didn't get in depth. But we will have more training on that. The new window here, I can show that we've got most of the videos are making their way onto our website. We'll have a real nice compact spot for them when all of them are finished. But in our video tutorials, just out on our website, we have a growing list of analysis, analyzing data. And so that'll go through everything we covered today. Here's that series just growing longer. We've got just one more video to put in here, and then we'll bundle it nice and put it into the LMS. But here's where you could go to get a slower look at each of the functions that we talked about today. And yeah, I can share the presentation slides. I'll make a note that when I send out the recording, I can send a link, call it the handout for these. Like I said, you'll be able to see those kind of throughout these videos as well. And to answer the other question about more conservative or better, 5%, 1%, or 10%. So your percent here, that significance level, you want to look, that's the decision there of looking at the penalty of failure is one thing to consider there. In general, you're saying how confident do we need to be in those results before we declare that something truly is significant or not. So the 1%, if you were to set this to 1%, we have to be very sure. You have to be 99% sure in order to get significance. So if you do see it there, yeah, I feel really great about that. That is a locked-in difference. Of course, you're running the risk of overlooking something that is pretty good, but not quite all the way to the 1%. And then the extreme, if you're at 10%, now we're loosening things up. We can maybe find some differences that we didn't with the one, but you're running that risk that you're getting a little too greedy, if you will, of seeing something that isn't a true difference. And now you have that false positive in that case. So yeah, unfortunately, as with a lot of the statistics, there's no easy button of just, yep, this is definitely what everyone should run. It's all a gradient. But those are just some of the things to think about, and yeah, find out industry-wide. Maybe everyone just uses the 5%. That's what most do. That's great. That's good enough. Or maybe you gotta make it harder and dig in a little bit. So great questions. All right, seeing no other questions. Thanks everyone for your time. Again, hopefully maybe we'll see you next week where we'll be doing some more statistics. A couple of the new features are playing comparisons, and the I forget the other one. Playing comparisons and the equivalence tests. Those two newer functions that we've added, we'll talk about. So, all right, until then, thanks everyone.